I always thought my marriage to Charles was strong and unshakable. 12 years together is no joke. Shared goals, a rhythm of life, traditions we had built over the years. We understood each other without words, shared joys and sorrows, and were best friends and lovers. So when he suggested, on that quiet evening, that I meet another man, my world felt like it was crumbling. We were sitting in our favorite cafe on the corner of the street, where the soft, cozy lamplight created an illusion of a secluded nook in the middle of the big city. Charles always chose the table by the window to watch the passers-by, while I loved losing myself and his stories about the people we saw. We ordered coffee with cinnamon and almond syrup, an unchanging ritual of our quiet evenings. This time, though, his eyes looked at me differently, deeper with a hidden intention. "Barbara," he began, setting down his cup and folding his hands as if preparing for an important conversation. "I've been wanting to talk to you about this for a while." A wave of anxiety swept over me. A suspicion crept in that something was wrong, but I couldn't quite grasp what it was. His tone, his seriousness, it was unusual. Charles was usually easygoing and smiling, but now his eyes held something more than just a desire to chat. "We've been together a long time, and you know I love you more than anything," he continued, taking a breath as if he were about to jump into cold water. "But I want to propose something unconventional. I want you to meet another man." Those words hit like an explosion in the quiet evening. I froze. My mind seemed to stop, and I stared at him, not knowing what to do next. "What do you mean?" I asked, trying not to let my voice tremble. Charles smiled slightly, trying to appear calm, but in his eyes I saw the same fear that gripped me. He held my gaze as if trying to convince me with his confidence. "It's not because I feel something is missing. I love you and I always will. But I want us to try something new, something that could bring us closer." My thoughts swirled in a chaotic vortex. Why? I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. On one hand, I completely trusted Charles, but his proposal shattered everything I believed about our marriage. I couldn't understand where this desire had come from. We had always been honest with each other, discussing everything, but this was entirely new and frightening. "Are you serious?" I asked, trying to find some hidden meaning in his words that I was missing. "Absolutely," he replied, looking at me with that strange mix of fear and hope. "It doesn't mean we have to do anything immediately. I just want you to think about it. I believe it could change us for the better." We sat in silence, and I stared at my coffee cup, clutching it with my hands, as if it could protect me. The idea of allowing something like this felt absurd, yet deep down I sensed a strange excitement. What if Charles was right? What if this could really change something? The thought flickered like a spark in the dark. I didn't know what to say. I didn't know how to react. But one thing was clear. The familiar world I thought was unbreakable had started to crack at the seams. After that evening at the cafe, I couldn't find peace. Questions spun endlessly in my head. What's behind all this? Why now? Why him? I wavered between wanting to dismiss it all and a strange, unfamiliar feeling of curiosity. Charles and I talked a lot, but every conversation left me with even more questions. He was patient, explaining that this wasn't an attempt to drift apart or to change, but rather a desire to come closer, to explore something new together. A week later, Charles suggested we go to a private party for couples who were also looking for something new. I agreed, more out of a desire to understand what was going on in my husband's mind. We arrived at a building on the outskirts of the city, where dim lights and soft jazz music greeted us at the entrance. Inside it was cozy yet unusual, soft sofas, muted lighting, and endless conversations that created an atmosphere where it was easy to get lost. We approached the bar, and after ordering us each a glass of wine, Charles suggested we take a walk. I felt like a stranger in this place, but at the same time, I was drawn to the atmosphere of lightness and freedom. Charles held my hand, and I searched his eyes for the confidence I lacked. There among the many faces I saw him, Daniel, tall with light stubble and a slightly ironic smile. He didn't stand out from the others, but there was something special in his gaze, calm, confidence, and a hint of interest. As if he already knew who I was, we exchanged a few meaningless phrases, but behind each of them I sensed a hidden subtext. "Want to get some fresh air?" He suggested, and I nodded, feeling unable to refuse. We stepped outside, where the cool night air immediately stung my skin. It was quiet, with only the occasional sounds of the distant city. Breaking the silence, Daniel stopped, looked at me, and suddenly asked, "Have you ever done something just for yourself, without considering what others expect?" His question caught me off guard. I didn't know what to say. After years of marriage and family life, I had long forgotten what it was like to act without thinking about the consequences. My mind told me to stop, but my heart whispered something else. Before I could say anything, Daniel gently touched my face, and everything around us seemed to disappear. He leaned in slowly and softly touched my lips with his, unhurried, as if testing if I was ready. It was a kiss that spoke more than 1,000 words. It wasn't passionate or forceful. It was calm and surprisingly tender, like a soothing wave washing over the shore after a storm. In that moment, I felt both free and vulnerable, and all my doubts seemed to vanish for a brief second. When the kiss ended, Daniel just smiled, as if it was the most natural thing in the world. We stood there, not saying a word, but I felt emotions awaken in me that I hadn't felt in a long time. It wasn't so much about him as it was about me, about discovering something within myself that I hadn't noticed before. We went back inside where Charles was waiting, watching from a distance. I sat down next to him, and he looked at me as if searching for an answer in my eyes. I felt a mix of joy and guilt, but Charles simply took my hand and smiled softly. "Are you okay?" he asked, and I nodded, unable to put into words the turmoil inside me. It was just a kiss, but it changed something within me. It wasn't about love, passion, or betrayal. It was about freedom and the realization that sometimes we need to step outside our comfort zones to better understand ourselves. After that night, something inside me changed. Charles and I returned home in complete silence, and even our cozy house felt different. I looked at the familiar walls, the photographs hanging in the hallway, our bedroom with the bed linens I had chosen with such care, and I couldn't shake the feeling that everything now held a different meaning. Daniel's words echoed in my mind. Have you ever done something just for yourself? This question became an obsession, like an unsolved riddle. I realized that for a long time, I had been living by others' expectations, caring for Charles, my work, the house, but not for myself. But understanding this didn't bring any relief. It only deepened my inner conflict. I didn't know how to continue living, like when the familiar boundaries were starting to collapse. Charles sensed it all. We sat in the kitchen, drinking our morning coffee, and the silence between us was almost tangible. He tried to keep the conversation going, but I caught his quick glances. He seemed to be searching for an answer in my eyes, afraid to ask the question out loud. "I don't want you to feel obligated or guilty," he said one night when we were lying in bed. Each of us turned away to our own side. "This shouldn't be a burden. I just want us both to find something new within ourselves, not to destroy what we already have." I stayed silent. I wanted to scream that I didn't understand what was happening to me, that I was lost and no longer knew the line between desire and fear. But instead, I clutched the blanket tighter and pretended everything was fine. At work, I became distracted, finding myself unable to hear what colleagues were saying, missing meetings, and losing track of conversations. I stared at my computer screen, but images kept surfacing in my mind. His kiss, the night city, the quiet conversation with Charles in the car. I wanted to run to the bathroom and let myself go. Cry, release everything that had built up, but I couldn't allow myself that weakness. I couldn't show how much it was consuming me. One evening, Charles suggested we spend a couple of days at our country house. It was our quiet retreat, a small house in the woods overlooking a lake. I agreed, thinking that a change of scenery might help me find answers. We packed our things and left the city the next day, leaving behind all the questions it had brought. When we arrived, I felt a little lighter. Charles lit the fireplace, and we sat together under a blanket, just like in the old days. We talked about everything except what was really bothering us. He shared stories about his work meetings, and I listened, but my thoughts were far away. On the second day, I woke up early and went out to the lake. The water was dark and calm, reflecting the gray sky. I looked at my reflection and saw a woman I barely recognized. I wanted to feel something, anger, relief, joy, anything, but instead there was emptiness inside, as if I was lost and didn't know how to find my way back. Charles joined me, hugging me from behind, and we stood there silently for several minutes. I felt his warmth and presence, but I couldn't stop thinking about Daniel and the feelings he had awakened. "Are you thinking about him?" Charles suddenly asked, and there was no reproach or jealousy in his voice, just quiet understanding. I wanted to lie, but I couldn't. "Yes," I answered honestly, "but it's not about him. It's about what this means for me." Charles nodded, as if he had been expecting that answer. We returned to the house, and he made coffee while I sat at the table, listening to the quiet drip of the coffee maker. We didn't need words. He knew I was searching for answers, and he didn't rush me. Those days at the cabin were like a break in the storm. I realized that Charles and I had grown closer, despite all the doubts. But I also knew that our journey was just beginning, and that we would have to find a balance between what we were searching for and what we already had. Returning to the city, I felt that the time spent at the country house had helped me gather my thoughts. But the question still lingered. There remained a nagging uncertainty and a strange sense of guilt toward Charles, unspoken but hovering in the air between us. We started living as if on two parallel paths, close but still apart. Charles understood me like no one else. One evening, he suggested meeting Daniel again, not because he was pushing me into it, but because he saw that I was still lost in my thoughts. He wanted me to find answers, even if it meant meeting the man who had stirred up this storm inside me. And despite my doubts, I agreed. We chose a neutral place, a modern art gallery. I didn't know why exactly there, but the idea felt right. Art always involved searching, feeling, and experiencing. And maybe among these paintings and installations, I would find a part of myself. Daniel arrived early and was waiting for us at the entrance. His eyes held the same calmness as during our first meeting, but now I saw something more in him. He had become a symbol of my own search, my desire to rediscover myself. We exchanged greetings, but there was no need for unnecessary words. Charles stayed a little to the side, giving me the space I needed. Daniel and I walked through the halls, silently observing abstract paintings filled with bursts of color and lines. I thought that art should explain something. But here in these rooms, it asked more questions than it answered, just like my life at that moment. In one of the rooms, where the walls were covered with massive canvases, Daniel suddenly stopped and turned to me. There was something new in his eyes, something elusive, not just interest, but a desire to understand. He stepped closer, and this time his movements were decisive, like those of someone who knew what needed to be done. "I think you're holding back a lot," he said quietly, almost in a whisper, and there was no mockery in his words, only understanding. "You're not afraid of me, you're afraid of yourself." Those words struck me like lightning. I couldn't respond properly, only slowly nodded, because I knew he was right. I was afraid of what I had uncovered in myself and of where it might lead. Daniel came closer, and this time the kiss was completely different. It wasn't gentle or calm, it was a collision. Sharp, intense, filled with passion and hidden emotions. I felt my hands gripping his shoulders as he pulled me closer, as if we were both seeking refuge from our inner chaos in that kiss. It was like a whirlwind pulling us in, making us forget everything around us. But suddenly I pulled away, as if something inside me said, "Enough." I took a deep breath and looked into his eyes. There was no longer the same confidence, and I realized that this moment was important not for him, but for me. In that kiss, I felt both my freedom and my fear. I was terrified of how far I could allow myself to go and how much I needed to stop. I stepped back and Daniel let me go without resistance. He understood that it wasn't just about the two of us. We were both searching for something of our own, but we found something greater, a boundary that didn't need to be crossed. When I returned to Charles, he looked up and, without asking unnecessary questions, understood everything from my face. I sat down beside him and he took my hand, squeezing it tightly as if afraid I might slip away again. We sat in the gallery, surrounded by paintings full of color and silent cries, and suddenly I felt relieved. "Are you okay?" he asked softly, with a touch of care in his voice. "Yes," I replied, and this time my words were not a lie. I realized that I need time, but I already know what I don't want. Charles nodded and pulled me close. In that moment, I understood that our journey was just beginning, and there was still much unpredictability ahead. But we were together. We were still learning to love, learning to trust, and most importantly, learning to be honest with ourselves. After the gallery, Charles and I returned home, but something had changed. Our apartment, filled with light and coziness, felt like more than just a refuge. It was now the place where a new chapter began. Every item in the house, from the old books to the paintings on the walls, now seemed like part of our journey. And although this was not the path I had expected to take, it felt like we were moving in the right direction. Charles stayed by my side through every moment. He didn't ask unnecessary questions, didn't pressure me, and didn't demand explanations. He became a quiet observer of my search, but I knew it wasn't easy for him either. We often sat in silence in the evenings, sometimes talking about trivial things, watching old movies we once loved, and finding common ground again in those small moments. It was a strange but pleasant feeling, rediscovering each other anew. It was during this period that we met Jessica and William. They were also looking for new horizons in their relationship and soon became close friends. Jessica was bright, energetic, and wise, with a spark in her eyes that hinted she had seen the world, not just from its beautiful side. William was her opposite, calm and thoughtful, like the eternal balancer of their shared life. We often met at a little cafe where we could sit leisurely with a cup of cappuccino and talk about anything without fear of being judged. Jessica and I shared our fears and hopes, and she always found the right words to restore my confidence. She told me that she and William had also faced difficult times when they doubted whether to continue exploring or return to the familiar. At these moments, she said, always ended with them growing closer and stronger. The most important thing is honesty with yourself and each other. She once said when we were sitting in the park, warming ourselves in the autumn sun, you can make mistakes, take steps back, but as long as you keep talking to each other and don't hide your feelings, everything will be fine. Her words resonated deeply within me. I realized that our journey wasn't just about meetings and new emotions. It was about not being afraid to be vulnerable in front of those we love. I told Charles about my doubts, about the fears that tormented me, and he listened without interrupting, only squeezing my hand tighter. Charles and I started spending more time with Jessica and William. We had dinners, played board games, discussed books and movies, but most importantly, we became part of something bigger. A community of people also trying to make sense of their feelings. Each meeting with them was like a small therapy session, a chance to speak and be understood. One evening we gathered at our place, and the evening didn't go as planned. The lasagna burned and the lights suddenly went out because of a storm. We lit candles and this unexpected event turned a regular dinner into something special. We laughed, drank wine, and shared stories from our lives. Jessica told us how she and William decided to travel through Europe, leaving their jobs and daily routine to rediscover each other in a new way. William quietly smiled, confirming every word she said, and I saw in their eyes something incredibly precious, deep understanding and acceptance of each other. That evening, I felt my fears slowly dissolving as I sat next to Charles. We were surrounded by people who genuinely supported us and didn't judge our choices. It was real support, the kind that gives you the strength to keep going even when the path ahead seems unclear. Later, when everyone had left and the house had fallen into silence, Charles and I were cleaning up the table. He stopped, looked at me, and without saying a word pulled me close. We stood there in the darkness, only the faint glow of candles flickering on the kitchen table. And for the first time in a long while, I felt that despite all our strange and not always understandable steps, we were still together. "Thank you for being here," he whispered, and I knew those words meant more than just gratitude. In that moment, I realized that our journey was not only about seeking new experiences, but also about returning to ourselves. It was a path we were walking together, even if sometimes we took steps in different directions.